They had it all: mansions, Oscars, millions in the bank. Then came the overdoses, the arrests, and the tragic headlines. From child stars forced to take pep pills at age 10 to A-list actors found dead in hotel bathrooms, these are Hollywood's darkest addiction stories. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's battle with addiction started when she was just a little girl. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm on June 10, 1922, and by the time she was 2, she was already performing on stage. Her mother, Ethel, was determined to make her a star. But instead of just guiding her, she controlled her. Before Judy even turned 10, her mother was giving her pills, some to keep her awake, some to make her sleep. Things got even worse when Judy signed with MGM Studios at 13. The studio wanted her to be perfect. They gave her pep pills to keep her working for days without rest. When she was exhausted, they gave her downers to force her to sleep. This cycle never stopped. Judy later said, "They'd give us pep pills. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us out with sleeping pills. After 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again." At 17, while filming The Wizard of Oz, the studio became even stricter. They thought she didn't look young enough, so they strapped down her chest, put her in tight corsets, and kept her on a strict diet. And, of course, they kept feeding her drugs. This destroyed her confidence. And from that point on, she struggled with her body image and addiction for the rest of her life. As she got older, things only got worse. By her 30s, she had a nervous breakdown and was sent to a private hospital. Her drug use made her unreliable. She missed performances, and people started losing trust in her. In 1959, at just 37 years old, she was hospitalized for liver problems caused by years of drug abuse. She had moments of success, like her legendary 1961 Carnegie Hall concert, but she could never escape her addiction. She once described herself as a walking advertisement for sleeping pills. Her personal life was a disaster. She was married 5 times, lost a lot of money, and kept falling deeper into addiction. On June 22, 1969, she was found dead in the bathroom of her London home. The cause of death was an accidental overdose of barbiturates. Her blood showed she had taken the equivalent of 10 Seconal capsules, far more than she could survive. Judy Garland had spent her entire life trying to live up to impossible expectations. The pressure, the drugs, and the need to always be perfect destroyed her. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston had one of the greatest voices of all time, but no matter how famous she became, addiction followed her everywhere. She was born on August 9, 1963, and by the time she was in her 20s, she was already a superstar. But behind the scenes, she was struggling. Her drug use started early. By the time she was in her 30s, it was no longer a secret. In 2002, during an interview with Diane Sawyer, Whitney admitted she used cocaine and other drugs. She famously said, "The biggest devil is me. I'm either my best friend or my worst enemy." Her addiction only got worse. On February 11, 2012, she was found unconscious in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The coroner's report revealed just how serious her drug use had been. They found drug paraphernalia in the bathroom, including a spoon with a white substance and a rolled-up piece of paper, clear signs of cocaine use. The toxicology report was even more shocking. Her body had cocaine, Xanax, marijuana, Benadryl, and a dangerous mix of other drugs. Even worse, her liver showed signs of cocaethylene, which happens when someone mixes cocaine with alcohol. This meant she had been using both before she died. The official cause of death was drowning, but drugs played a major role. Her arteries were 60% blocked, which meant her heart was in bad shape. Years of cocaine use had damaged her body so much that even if she hadn't drowned, she was already at high risk of a heart attack. Whitney had tried to get clean. In 2009, she told Oprah Winfrey she was finally drug-free. But by 2012, it was clear she had relapsed. Her death at 48 was a tragic loss, not just for her family and fans, but as a reminder of how addiction can destroy even the most successful people. Robert Downey Jr. Robert Downey Jr. is one of Hollywood's biggest stars today, but for years his life was a complete mess. His addiction almost destroyed him, and if he hadn't turned things around, he wouldn't be here today. He was born on April 4th, 1965, and his introduction to drugs happened shockingly early. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was also an addict. Instead of protecting his son, he gave him marijuana when he was just 6 years old. That's how it started. As he got older, things got worse. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, when his career was taking off, so was his drug use. By 1995, he was addicted to heroin and crack cocaine. He kept getting arrested. In 1996, he was pulled over while speeding down Sunset Boulevard with heroin, cocaine, and a .357 Magnum in his car. In 1997, he missed a drug test and was arrested again. Then, in 1999, he wandered into a stranger's house while high and fell asleep in their child's bed. The law finally caught up with him. In 1999, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served nearly a year before being released on parole. But within months, he was arrested again for drug possession. His addiction was ruining his career. In 2001, he was fired from Ally McBeal. Hollywood was done with him. But in 2003, everything changed. His girlfriend, Susan Levin, gave him a choice: get clean or lose her. That was his wake-up call. He threw himself into recovery, using a mix of therapy, 12-step programs, yoga, and meditation. Even after he got clean, Hollywood didn't trust him. Studios didn't want to hire him because they thought he was too much of a risk. But one person believed in him: Mel Gibson. Gibson personally paid for Downey's insurance so he could star in The Singing Detective, 2003. That gave him a second chance. Then came Iron Man, 2008. Marvel Studios took a huge gamble casting him as Tony Stark, but it was the best decision they ever made. The movie was a massive success, and Downey became one of the biggest stars in the world. As of 2024, Robert Downey Jr. has been sober for over 15 years. His story is proof that no matter how far you fall, you can rise again. He went from being a drug addict who lost everything to one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen had everything: talent, money, and fame. But drugs and reckless behavior destroyed it all. He was born on September 3, 1965, and became famous in the 1980s with movies like Platoon and Wall Street. His career was taking off, but behind the scenes, trouble was already starting. By 1990, at just 25 years old, he had already checked into rehab for drug use. That was only the beginning. In 1998, things took a dangerous turn. Sheen overdosed on cocaine and suffered a near-fatal stroke. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors had to pump his stomach to save him. This should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't. His drug use only got worse. By the 2000s, he was one of the highest-paid actors on TV, making $1.8 million per episode on 2.5 Men. But even that wasn't enough to keep him from self-destruction. In 2011, his life spiraled out of control. he was sent to rehab, which put his show on hold. Then he started giving bizarre interviews, saying things like he was on a drug called Charlie Sheen, and that he had tiger blood and Adonis DNA. He even called himself a warlock and kept saying he was winning. The media had a field day with his meltdown, but Warner Brothers wasn't laughing. They fired him from 2.5 Men on March 7, 2011. Without the show, Sheen's drug use got even worse. He later admitted he was spending up to $200,000 a week on drugs. The people around him feared he wouldn't survive. His personal life also crumbled. He lost custody of his kids, went through multiple divorces, and destroyed his career. Then, in 2015, he revealed something shocking. He had been HIV positive since 2011. This only added to his struggles. It took years, but in 2017, Sheen announced he had been sober for a year. Looking back in 2021, he called his meltdown juvenile and admitted it ruined his career and relationships. Haim. Cory Haim had the perfect Hollywood dream: fame, money, and a bright future. But drugs took it all away. He was born on December 23, 1971, and became a teen idol in the 1980s with movies like The Lost Boys and License to Drive. But while fans saw a young actor with a big smile behind the scenes, Cory was heading down a dark path. It all started when he was just 15, on the set of Lucas. That's when he first tried drugs. By the time he was filming The Lost Boys at 16, he had already moved on to marijuana. Then, in 1988, while filming License to Drive, his drug use got out of control. He later said that was the moment he fully became addicted. The 1990s and 2000s were a nightmare. Cory couldn't stop using. He checked into rehab 15 times. He overdosed multiple times. His best friend, Corey Feldman, once found him foaming at the mouth, barely able to breathe. Things were so bad that Feldman had to shove charcoal down his throat to save him. In 2010, a shocking report from the California Attorney General showed just how deep Cory's addiction had gone. In his last month alive, he visited 7 doctors and 7 pharmacies, collecting 553 pills: Valium, Soma, Vicodin, and Xanax. He was barely holding on. Drugs destroyed everything. At one point, Cory became so reclusive that he stayed inside his apartment for 3.5 years, gaining over 150 pounds. Even his friendship with Feldman fell apart because of his addiction. In 2004, it seemed like he had finally beaten his demons. He moved back to Toronto with his mother and appeared to be clean. But it didn't last. On March 10, 2010, Cory was found unresponsive in his mother's apartment. He was only 38. At first, people thought he had overdosed, but later, the coroner said he had died from pneumonia, made worse by an enlarged heart. Still, years of drug abuse had taken a toll on his body. Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse had a voice like no one else. She became a global star with her soulful music, but addiction controlled her life. Born on September 14, 1983 in London, she shot to fame with hits like Rehab. But behind the success, she was battling a dangerous relationship with drugs and alcohol. Amy struggled with depression, and instead of getting help, she turned to drinking. In a 2007 interview, she admitted, "I do drink a lot. I think it's symptomatic of my depression." She became known for her wild partying, and her addiction only got worse. She used everything: heroin, crack cocaine, ecstasy, and alcohol. But instead of getting better, she made a song about it. Rehab became a huge hit, with Amy proudly singing that she wouldn't go to rehab. Sadly, the song was a warning about what was coming. Her problems only got worse. In 2007, she overdosed on heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, ketamine, and alcohol all at once. She survived, but it didn't change anything. She tried rehab multiple times, but she couldn't stay clean. Her last concert in Serbia in 2011 was a disaster. She was so drunk she could barely stand, let alone sing. Then, on July 23, 2011, Amy was found dead at just 27 years old. The toxicology report showed her blood alcohol level was more than 5 times the legal limit. 3 empty vodka bottles were in her room. Strangely, there were no illegal drugs in her system. She had actually been sober for 3 weeks before her death, but relapsed just days before. The coroner ruled her death as death by misadventure. It wasn't intentional, but it was caused by her reckless drinking. Her sudden death made her part of the infamous 27 Club, a group of musicians who all died at 27, including Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain. Cory Monteith. Cory Monteith had everything: a great career, fame, and millions of fans who loved him. But behind the success, he was fighting a battle that had started when he was just a kid. On July 13, 2013, at just 31 years old, he was found dead in his hotel room in Vancouver. He had taken a deadly mix of heroin and alcohol. The news shocked Hollywood and broke the hearts of Glee fans everywhere. Monteith's struggle with addiction started early. By 13, he was already drinking and smoking marijuana. By 16, he was using even harder drugs. His family tried to help. When he was 19, they sent him to rehab. But addiction followed him even as he became famous. In March 2013, just 4 months before he died, he checked himself into rehab again. He was trying to fight it, but addiction is a tough enemy. The night he died, he was alone in his hotel room. Police later found a spoon with drug residue, a used needle, and 2 empty champagne bottles. His blood alcohol level was way over the legal driving limit, and the heroin in his system was enough to kill him. What made it even more tragic was that rehab had lowered his tolerance, making the drugs even more dangerous. His body couldn't handle what it used to. His death was a harsh reminder of how addiction doesn't care about success or fame. It can take hold of anyone. Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore was famous before she even understood what fame was. At just 7 years old, she stole hearts in E.T. the Extraterrestrial. But while people saw a sweet little girl on screen, her real life was completely different. By 9, she was drinking alcohol. By 10, she was smoking marijuana. By 12, she was using cocaine. Her mother, Jade Barrymore, didn't stop her. In fact, she took young Drew to clubs like Studio 54 in New York, where she partied with adults instead of going to school. It wasn't long before things got out of control. By 13, she had been in rehab. She was depressed, addicted, and had even attempted suicide. At 14, she made a shocking decision. She legally separated from her parents and became an adult in the eyes of the law. She was still just a kid, but she was completely on her own. She spent the next 18 months in a mental health facility. It wasn't like Hollywood at all. There was no glamour. Every day was filled with therapy, school, and strict rules. It was a dark time, but it forced her to face the pain that had pushed her into addiction. Addiction ran in her family. Her grandfather, John Barrymore, was a famous actor who drank himself to death. Her aunt, Diana Barrymore, also struggled with drugs and died from an overdose. Drew was part of a family trapped in a cycle of addiction, and breaking free wasn't easy. But she survived. Unlike so many Hollywood stars who lost their battle with addiction, she fought her way out. Kurt Cobain. Kurt Cobain was more than a rock star. He was a voice for a whole generation. His music with Nirvana changed everything. But behind the fame, he was suffering. He battled depression, pain, and a heroin addiction that would eventually lead to his tragic death. Cobain's struggle with drugs started in 1987 when he was just 20. He had a stomach condition that caused him unbearable pain. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. He once said that heroin was the only thing that kept him from ending his own life. As Nirvana got bigger, his addiction got worse. In 1992, before performing on Saturday Night Live, he overdosed during a photo shoot. He kept falling asleep, barely able to stay awake. The next morning, he overdosed again. His wife, Courtney Love, brought him back. His drug use affected everything. During Nirvana's 1991 European tour, he was so deep into heroin that he thought about suicide. In 1993, just before performing in New York, he overdosed again. Instead of calling an ambulance, Love gave him a drug to wake him up. He went on stage as if nothing had happened. In March 1994, things got worse. He overdosed in Rome after mixing champagne and Rohypnol. Love later said this was his first real suicide attempt. A month later, on April 8, 1994, he was found dead in his Seattle home. The heroin in his blood was at a dangerously high level. He had also shot himself. Cobain was only 27. His death was one of the biggest tragedies in music history. His story is a reminder that even fame and success can't fix deep pain. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Hoffman's struggle with addiction started when he was young. In his late teens, he drank and used drugs. By the time he was 22, he realized he had a problem and checked himself into rehab. After that, he stayed clean. For years, he focused on his career, becoming one of the greatest actors of his generation. He won an Oscar in 2005 for playing Truman Capote. Everything seemed fine. Then, in 2013, something changed. He admitted that he had relapsed. It started with prescription pills, but soon he was using heroin. He knew he was in trouble, so he checked into rehab again. He stayed for 10 days trying to get clean, but 10 days wasn't enough. He kept using. On the morning of his death, his body was found in his Manhattan apartment. A syringe was still in his arm. Around him, police found 65 bags of heroin, along with prescription pills. The autopsy showed a deadly mix of heroin, cocaine, and other drugs in his system. His relapse had been fast, and it had been deadly. His death was a shock. People couldn't believe that after staying clean for so long, he had fallen back so hard. But addiction never really goes away. Even after years of sobriety, one bad decision can bring everything crashing down. In fact, relapsing after a long time can be even more dangerous. The body loses its tolerance, and an overdose becomes more likely. River Phoenix. River Phoenix was only 23 years old when he died. He was young, talented, and just getting started. But on October 31, 1993, outside the Viper Room nightclub in Los Angeles, his life ended in the worst way possible. He collapsed on the sidewalk, shaking, struggling to breathe. By the time help arrived, it was too late. That night, River was at the club with his girlfriend, Samantha Mathis, and his siblings, Joaquin and Rain. It was supposed to be a fun night. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. Inside the club, River had been taking drugs, a dangerous mix. His body couldn't handle it. Around 1 a.m., he walked outside, fell to the ground, and started convulsing. His brother, Joaquin, called 911. But there was nothing they could do. The autopsy revealed the truth. River had taken a deadly combination of heroin and cocaine, also known as a speedball. His system also had Valium, marijuana, and ephedrine. The mix was too much. His body shut down. What made his death even more shocking was that River didn't seem like the type to use hard drugs. He was known for being different from other Hollywood stars. He was a vegan. He cared about the environment. He stayed away from the party scene. At least, that's what people thought. But behind the scenes, things were different. His struggle with drugs had been going on for years. Reports say he started using as a teenager. He first smoked marijuana with his friend, child actor Corey Feldman. Over time, things escalated. Hollywood put a lot of pressure on young stars, and River wasn't immune to it. John Belushi. John Belushi was one of the funniest men in Hollywood, a true legend. He made people laugh on Saturday Night Live, and his role in the Blues Brothers made him a star. But behind the scenes, he was struggling. His drug use was out of control. And on March 5, 1982, it killed him. He was only 33. In the days before his death, John was staying at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. He was supposed to be working on a movie script, but instead, his hotel room had turned into a drug-fueled party. He was using cocaine non-stop. He was spending thousands of dollars on it. His friends were worried, but no one could stop him. The night before he died, Robin Williams and Robert De Niro visited him. They saw what was happening. The drugs, the chaos. They didn't stay long. They knew something was wrong, but they left. The next morning, John was found unresponsive. He had overdosed. The autopsy confirmed what everyone feared. He had taken a speedball, a deadly mix of heroin and cocaine. His death sent shockwaves through Hollywood. It wasn't just the loss of a great comedian. It was a wake-up call. At the time, drug use was everywhere in the industry. It was normal. In fact, during the filming of the Blues Brothers, cocaine use was so common that it was actually included in the film's budget. People didn't take it seriously until Belushi died. The fallout was huge. A woman named Kathy Smith, who had been with him that night, admitted to giving him the fatal injection. She was later charged with involuntary manslaughter. Meanwhile, Belushi's story became a lesson in what happens when drug use is ignored. A book called Wired was later written about his life. It painted a brutal picture of his addiction, showing just how much fame and success couldn't protect him. Some people thought the book was too harsh, but it told the truth. Belushi didn't just die from drugs, he died from a lifestyle that let it happen. Angelina Jolie. Before Angelina Jolie became a Hollywood icon and a respected humanitarian, her life was filled with chaos, addiction, and self-destruction. In her early 20s, she was deep into drug abuse. A shocking video from 1998 shows her looking thin and restless, walking around an apartment after allegedly using heroin and cocaine. The video was released by her former drug dealer, giving the world a glimpse into the dark reality of her life back then. Jolie has never hidden the truth. She once admitted, "I've done coke, heroin, ecstasy, LSD, everything." Drugs were her way of dealing with pain. Since she was a teenager, she had battled depression, often turning to self-harm. But one of the most terrifying moments in her life came when she was 22. Overwhelmed by her struggles, she actually hired a hitman to kill her. She believed her family would handle her death better if it looked like a murder instead of suicide. In a strange twist, the hitman refused. Instead, he convinced her to rethink her decision. That moment may have saved her life. Her drug use was so extreme that when she got the lead role in Tomb Raider in 2001, the studio didn't trust her. They made her take drug tests every single day, just to keep her job. At that time, an old video of her drug use had gone public, and people doubted whether she was stable enough to handle a major movie. But despite everything, Tomb Raider was a massive hit. It marked a turning point in her life. By the time she was 20, she said she had already used almost every drug. She had tried to take her own life twice, once at 19 and again at 22. Things got so bad that when she was 24, she had a mental breakdown and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for 3 days. Everything changed in 2002 when she adopted her first child, Maddox. She later said, "I knew once I committed to Maddox, I would never be self-destructive again." Being a mother gave her a reason to change. She no longer had the option to fall apart. Since then, Jolie has completely turned her life around. She has dedicated herself to humanitarian work, traveling the world to help refugees and those in crisis. Steven Tyler, the wild frontman of Aerosmith, lived the rock star life to the extreme. His drug addiction was so out of control that he once admitted to spending $20 million on cocaine. In 1988 alone, he spent $6 million on drugs. That's not just a bad habit. That's an entire fortune gone up in smoke. It all started in the 1970s, when Aerosmith was becoming one of the biggest bands in the world. The music industry back then was full of drugs, and Tyler was right in the middle of it. He used cocaine, heroin, meth, and LSD. Looking back, he said, "I don't think there were any bands that even knew what sober was." His addiction completely took over his life. He later joked, "I snorted my Porsche, I snorted my plane, I snorted my house." He was selling off expensive cars, houses, and even his private jet just to afford more drugs. But the drugs didn't just cost him money. They nearly destroyed Aerosmith. He became so unreliable that concerts were canceled. His behavior was unpredictable. Album sales dropped. His bandmates had enough. In the 1980s, they staged an intervention and gave him a choice: go to rehab or leave the band. He chose rehab, and for a while, it worked. He stayed clean for over a decade, and during that time, Aerosmith had some of their biggest hits. But the battle wasn't over. In the early 2000s, after foot surgery, he was prescribed painkillers. That prescription turned into a full-blown relapse. Tyler went back to rehab multiple times, struggling to break free from addiction. In 2009, he finally committed to sobriety again, and he's stayed clean ever since. He's been to rehab 8 times in his life, proving just how hard addiction is to escape. At 73, Tyler now looks back on his wild years with a mix of regret and humor. He once joked that he had snorted half of Peru. But behind the jokes is a serious message. Addiction can take everything from you. Lindsay Lohan. Lindsay Lohan had everything: talent, fame, and a promising career. But addiction and bad decisions sent her life into a tailspin, turning her into one of Hollywood's most infamous cautionary tales. Her struggles started young. At just 20 years old, she checked into rehab for the first time. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 6 years, she would go in and out of rehab 5 times, spending a total of 250 days trying to get clean. Then came the arrests. In May 2007, she crashed her Mercedes in Beverly Hills and was arrested for DUI. Just 2 months later, she was arrested again, this time with cocaine in her possession. From that point on, her life became a never-ending cycle of court dates, probation violations, and jail time. Between 2007 and 2012, Lohan was in court over 20 times. She violated probation 4 times and was sentenced to 120 days in jail. But because of overcrowding, she barely spent 2 weeks behind bars. The most infamous moment came in 2011, when she was caught stealing a $2,500 necklace from a jewelry store. Once again, she was sentenced to jail, but most of her sentence was turned into house arrest. Her addiction didn't just ruin her reputation, it destroyed her career. She became unreliable on movie sets, missing filming days and causing delays. Directors and producers stopped hiring her. At the same time, her finances collapsed. By 2012, she owed the IRS $233,904 in back taxes. She had once been worth millions, but her money had disappeared into legal fees, rehab costs, and lost acting opportunities. She tried to turn things around. In 2013, she completed a court-ordered 90-day rehab stay after crashing her car and lying to the police about it. But recovery wasn't easy. In 2014, she revealed that she had suffered a miscarriage, which triggered another relapse. Today, Lohan says she is finally sober and has found stability. But her story is a reminder of how quickly fame and fortune can disappear when addiction takes control.